So my name is Andrew Bramlett. I've lived down in Kennesaw. I'm a student at Kennesaw State, hooty hoo. And I'm just very interested in history, very interested in Georgia's story. I love researching it all. So I first got interested in Georgia state parks, especially their history, just through visiting them. I mean, there's so many great sites to visit, so many wonderful places to see, and just visiting some of these sites and asking questions about how this came to be, why it's preserved like it is today. That's what really got me interested in researching a lot of these park stories. The most interesting thing I found while researching these parks, it's kind of a weird one, but was actually the former state parks. Thinking about how many parks there are throughout the state that were once state parks but aren't anymore was just really fascinating to me, and I had a lot of fun looking into those stories as well.
Good evening. Good evening. Welcome to the Bartow History Museum. We turned off the sprinklers for you to come in this evening. So, my name is Trey Gaines. I'm director of the museum, and we're glad to have you out to join us this evening and have a very interesting program lined up for you with lots of good show and tell bits. But before we get started, let me give a couple of upcoming announcements. For those of you that are regulars, you know that we have a Lunch and Learn on the third Wednesday of every month, and so August 21st will be our next Lunch and Learn experience. Tom McElhenney, who's a docent up at the Funk Heritage Center over in Kenton and Waleska, will be here to talk about the Cherokee and the Iroquois, the connections between the two. Also in August, on August the 10th, we're holding a digital camera workshop to go along with our current temporary exhibit on cameras that I hope you all will check out while you're here this evening. Louis Tonsmeyer will be leading that workshop, so if you're interested in learning more about digital cameras and how they work and how to take good pictures with them, Louis is the one to tell you. So that workshop is on Saturday, August the 10th. While you're here this evening, I mentioned check out our exhibit on cameras. That will be up to the end of August, so you've got a few more weeks to see that. And also in the hallway, we have a photographic exhibit called Doors. That's a collaborative exhibit with the Booth Photography Guild. We challenged the members of that guild to go out into the world and take pictures of a door, playing off our theme here, or our motto here at the museum of opening a door to the past. 25 photographers came back with pictures of doors from Cartersville to Portugal. Wow. And everywhere in between. So that's a neat exhibit. It's the three walls out here in the hallway. Check that out. And there are three ribbons you'll notice. We had a People's Choice Award competition, and we gave those ribbons out last week at our August Lunch and Learn. And so you'll see those first, second, and third winners of the People's Choice Awards. And that will also be up through the end of August with the cameras. All right, well, let's get started this evening. Let me introduce our speaker. Andrew Bramlett is a local historian who lives in Kennesaw and has been coming to the Bartow History Museum for a number of years, and we've gotten to be good friends with Andrew. He has researched the history of Georgia's current and former state parks, along with a variety of other topics. And you can check out all the topics that he's been researching and writing on at his website, ajbramlett.com.
I do have business cards with me.
I do encourage you to check that out. He's got a lot of great PowerPoints and videos and a lot of good historical content there on the website. And currently, Andrew is a student at Kennesaw State University in the history department, if you can believe that.
Go Owls.
Andrew is here with his mom and dad and brother. Wave, wave. There you go. Please join me in welcoming Andrew Bramlett.
So throughout our state, there are about 62 state parks and historic sites, from FDR's Little White House to natural wonders like Cloudland Canyon and the beauty of the Georgia coast. Today's presentation focuses on the history of these historic sites. However, I won't be able to get into everything. I'll be covering about 14 to 15 of those parks out of the whole 62. If you do have a favorite park that I do not cover, you're welcome to mention it right at the end, and if I happen to remember its history, I will try to share what I can. This project began back in 2020 at the very start of the COVID pandemic, where within weeks we all at home got very stir crazy and decided we would do some type of weird project. For me, it ended up being videos. I did a lot of videos back in the pandemic, about 400, all on my website, gotta plug that in there. And one of the earliest series that I did was the history of the former state park, of the current state parks in Georgia, which eventually turned into former state parks. Whole other story all its own. These current state parks I really got interested in it because of just visiting sites like Red Top Mountain or Etowah Indian Mounds, Cloudwind Canyon, Providence Canyon, a lot of very important sites around the state. But for many, especially the natural sites, we don't often talk about their history, but how these pikes came to be preserved. So that's kind of what I focused on in that original research and what the focus is of this presentation. So with all that being said, I will actually start with a history. If I can get this going. How to use the computer? Oh, it's computer's fault. There it is. With history of the Georgia State Pike system, just sort of as a whole. The very first pike inside the state of Georgia, state pike-wise, was Indian Springs State Pike, and I'll be getting more into its history in just a moment. Until 1927, it was also the only state pike inside the state of Georgia. In that year, the Vogel family of Minnesota gave land in Blairsville for use as a state pike. At that point, it became an official state pikes system, as now there were two that you could officially call a system. During the late 1800s, early 1900s, the U.S. was beginning to recognize the need to set aside land for preservation and recreational use. This is also kind of along the same lines of the early national pikes, especially the late 1800s. As a result, the state of Georgia recognized this as being very important and decided after the Vogels gave that land to keep building the state pike system. The Great Depression also had a major impact on the pike's histories. In 1933, President FDR authorized the establishment of the Civilian Conservation Corps, also called the CCC. The CCC was young men aged 18 to 25 who worked on many state and national pike sites across the country. The work of the CCC can still be found inside many state pikes in Georgia, and their story will keep coming up in today's presentation. So the first pike is Indian Springs State Pike, and I also will be covering it first. In this presentation, the pikes are in chronological order in terms of when they were established. I didn't try to do it in geographical order, as that would just get too confusing. So Indian Springs State Pike is in Flovilla, right in Butts County. It's halfway between McDonough and Forsyth, just a few miles off of I-75. Still very accessible today. The Indian Springs are a natural mineral spring the pike describes as having a unique sulfur smell, believed for hundreds of years to have healing powers. In 1825, the state government wanted the land inhabited by the Creek Nation in the area. Creek leader William McIntosh signed a treaty giving some of the Creek land to the state, and that treaty was actually signed at Indian Springs, and hence is called the Treaty of Indian Springs. Some of the Creek Nation actually viewed this treaty as fraudulent and ended up killing Chief McIntosh just about a year later. After the state took control of the land, land lot number 1 in the original survey was set aside as a public recreation area. The lot was only 10 acres, but included the Indian Springs, making it the oldest state-owned recreation area in the entire country, not just the state of Georgia. Because of this, it is often cited as the very first state pike in the United States of America. Others say it was in New York, as New York had the first place actually called a state pike. Personally, I have to go with Georgia here, not just because of state pride, but because it is a state setting aside land for preservation. As time went on, the springs became very popular with tourists. This picture is the Indian Springs Hotel, actually right outside the pike boundaries today. It was built by Chief McIntosh back in 1823, and is the only 19th century mineral springs hotel like this remaining inside the state. It's currently a museum and a bed and breakfast. In 1927, it was designated a state forest pike, becoming a state pike in 1931. During the Great Depression, CCC Camp 459 helped to establish and work on the pike. The young men of this camp built much of the pike's early infrastructure, including this building called the Spring House. The spring still bubbles out today. This sort of rock look here, you'll see it in a couple pictures from this pike. All those sort of rock buildings are from the CCC era, from the 1930s. They, throughout the nation, used a lot of natural materials in what they built. Indian Springs is no exception. Here's just another view of that spring house down below. Up above is the Pike's Casino, which sounds all exciting, but it was what we called sort of a dance pavilion back then. There wasn't any gambling of any kind. The name's kind of changed over the years. This next pike is actually Vogel State Pike in Blairsville in Union County. The Native Americans who lived in the area believed it was the land of the Nunahee, meaning people who live forever. No one exactly sure why that is or what it means, just makes a nice little mystery out there. By the 20th century, however, this land was used for logging. The Fistu Vogel Tanning Company of Milwaukee owned the land, and the company cut down oak and hemlock trees so the bark of them could be used for leather. It was used in the tanning process. During World War I, an artificial version of this bark was created, so trees were no longer needed for the tanning process. Because of this, the Fistu Vogel Company was left with this massive piece of land in North Georgia, with pristine woodlands, but with nothing to do with it. Fred and Augustus Vogel gave land to the state of Georgia in 1927 and became the second state and recreation area in our state. It was designated Vogel State Forest Park, became Vogel State Park in 1931. At the same time, the state park system was established. CCC men also worked at this park, in this case Camp 432, shown here working on some of the logging. I guess clearing out dead trees here. As a part of their work, they restored the Walayasi Inn that was just south of the park. It's technically right outside the park boundaries, but it's close enough. It's still very much part of its history. This building still stands today and is on the National Registry of Historic Places. The CCC also built the 22-acre Lake Triwata inside the park, now still popular with swimmers.
Andrew, on that last slide, do you know if that place is still an inn?
I believe it is a hiker's resting spot. It's right along the Appalachian Trail today. The park is notable as being close to Blood Mountain, which is the highest point on the Appalachian Trail. And the Walayasi Inn that I showed, which is also, as I mentioned, right along it, there's actually a part of a trail that goes through the building, making it the only part of a trail to go through any man-made structure. Today, Vogel offers 17 miles of hiking trails. There's camping and fishing opportunities on 242 acres. I did have to check on this one. The math does not sound right. 17 miles of trails, 242 acres. That is how it is listed on the state park website. I do not believe that personally, but I'll just have to trust their data on that one. I don't get the math of the map behind that, but I'll just trust it for now. This next park is also a North Georgia one, Fort Mountain State Park, but has a very mysterious past near Chatsworth and Murray County. Like Vogel, it's also one of the earliest inside the state of Georgia. Fort Mountain is named after a mysterious 885-foot wall at the mountain's peak. The park history says the wall was built about the year 500 for religious purposes by Native Americans, which seems like a decent theory to me. However, with a mysterious structure like this on the middle of a remote mountain, it is bound to invite conspiracy theories, which is what I'll be sharing now. There are many, many legends surrounding its creation. My personal favorite, if you believe this, y'all have fun with that. I believe it is absolutely nuts, but I love to share it. There are some who say it was built by Prince Madoc, a legendary Welsh prince who supposedly came to the New World in the year 1170, 300 years before Christopher Columbus. I do not believe this at all, let me emphasize. I'm just sharing this for the entertainment value, but I do think it's very interesting. Others say it was built by a group called the Moon-Eyed People of Cherokee legend. They got that name because they did not go out during the day. And some say that these Moon-Eyed People and Prince Madoc are just one and the same legend put together. There's also another theory that says built by Hernando de Soto, which I think is very interesting as he was actually in the area, but it seems like a lot of effort to go to and not be documented in de Soto's journals. There are also some who say it was a Cherokee honeymoon spot, which is very odd to me. The park was created in 1936 after prominent Atlanta businessman Ivan Allen Sr. gave the original land made up the park. Many in Georgia are still familiar with Ivan Allen Jr., the longtime Atlanta mayor. This is his father. The land, when it was given to the state of Georgia, already had cabins, a small lake, and trails. It had been used, I think, as a private recreation area, not open to the public. When Ivan Allen gave it to the state, it was opened up to anyone at that point. Like so many of the other parks throughout our state park system, the CCC played a major role in its early development. Probably the most impressive thing they built was the fire tower on top of a mountain. Construction was overseen by a man named Arnold Bailey. He was a local mason. To impress his sweetheart, he carved a large stone heart in one of the rocks above the door, which can still be found there today. Sadly, in 1971, the cupola on top, built out of wood, burned in a fire, leaving the structure looking like this for many years. Decades, really. Incredibly, in 2015, the tower and cupola were fully restored back to their original appearance, and it still sort of guides over the pike today. Today, Fort Mountain is 3,712 acres, has 25 miles of trails, cabin, camping, fishing, and mini golf. Mini golf will come up a lot today. Next up, also from North Georgia, Amicaloa Falls, halfway between Dahlonega and Ellijay in Dawson County. The Cherokee called the falls Amicaloa, meaning tumbling waters. A very good name for the waterfall, I should add. One of the earliest references to the falls comes back in 1832. A man named William Williamson wrote Governor Wilson Lumpkin in that year, stating, "In the course of my route in the mountains, I have discovered a waterfall, perhaps the greatest in the world, the most majestic scene that I have ever witnessed or heard of. The creek passes over the mountain and the fall, and I think can't be less than 600 yards. The mountain is at least 3/4 of a mile high. I made great exertion to get on the summit, but the ascent was so great that I was completely exhausted by the time I reached halfway." I believe we had a similar experience visiting a couple years ago. "My position was such that I had a perfect view of the entire fall. The stream is called Amicaloa, meaning from the fall." One of the waterfall's first owners was a man named Bartley Crane, who came to the area in 1852. He had a corn and flour mill at what's now the visitor center. In 1860, there was a campground for Methodist Church established there right near the base of the falls. That later served as a training camp during the Civil War, according to some accounts for both sides of the war. Bartley Crane's son, John, owned the land until 1940, when he sold the land to the state of Georgia. The project became famous in 1958. In that year, the southern end of the Appalachian Trail moved from Oglethorpe Mountain to Springer Mountain, just near the falls. Today, Amicaloa Falls serves as a gateway to the 2,100-mile trail. In 1991, the Pike's Lodge was added, and in 2001, steps were built to reach the top of the falls. I should say that while the Appalachian Trail does not technically start at Amicaloa Falls, it's just about a couple miles away, so it's sort of the unofficial starting point. Amicaloa is actually the tallest cascading waterfall east of the Mississippi River at 792 feet. Though it is still under the state of Georgia, it's actually privately managed by a group called North Georgia Mountain Authority and Coral Hospitality, who also manages that Pike Lodge. They offer hiking, ziplining, archery, and a natural wonder of Georgia. Now, there's one more thing I want to add in here. I don't have a picture of it, unfortunately, so you have to take my word for it. But if you're walking up the waterfall, up the steps on the side, which interestingly can't really be seen here, if you're about 3/4 of the way up and you look down for the slats in the wood, you can actually see an old rusting truck there. And naturally we had to ask about this because that's kind of odd. What we were told is that back in the, I believe, the late 50s or early 60s, someone on a dare drove their truck over the side of a waterfall and they could not get it out. So it's still there today.
What is that water?
The water, don't know much about that side, unfortunately.
The background.
Oh, the background here? Oh, yes. This is actually a postcard of a yacht club down in St. Simon's Island. I just used a couple Georgia tourism postcards in the background. Sorry, I misunderstood the question there. Not at all. So I actually collect postcards. I have a lot from Georgia. I have some of this table up here today. And I picked out some that look very natural, like nice scenes. I picked about 7 or 8, and you'll see them circle through in the background as we go along. There are a couple of our state pikes I'll be talking about today. So next is Roosevelt's Little White House State Historic Site, right near Warm Springs in Meriwether County. I'm a big fan of presidential history, one of my other weird hobbies, so this fits in well into that. It's very close to Franklin D. Roosevelt State Park, both in history and geography, from only covering Little White House today. In 1924, Franklin Roosevelt first came to these springs at Warm Springs, seeking relief from pain caused by his polio. A friend of his named George Foster Peabody told him about this spring, often right sort of near Columbus, and said that the minerals in it may help Roosevelt in curing a bit of that pain, at least temporarily. Roosevelt loved the area, and he found he could actually swim in the water despite out of the water being paralyzed basically from the hip down. In 1927, he purchased the entire Warm Springs Resort, today called Roosevelt Warm Springs Institute for Rehabilitation. He began opening up to polio patients and advertising it as a place sort of for rest and relaxation, and also for medical treatment. After being elected president in 1932, he built a small house near the springs made of Georgia pine, and the house became known as Roosevelt's Little White House. His original home was much closer to the springs themselves, right at the Roosevelt Institute, but he found being president, people kept, coming up to the house and asking for favors. So he wanted a place a little bit more remote, a bit more secluded, and that he could have guided. During his presidency, Roosevelt would go to the house on 16 different occasions, each for about 3 weeks at a time. Though Roosevelt was from New York, Georgia ended up becoming kind of his second home during his presidency. He became a very beloved fixture of the Warm Springs area. On March 30th, 1945, he arrived for what would be his final trip to Warm Springs. On April 12th of that year, he sat down inside the dining room to have a portrait done by Elizabeth Shumatoff. Halfway through the painting, he suffered a stroke and passed away later that day inside one of the home's bedrooms. The painting stayed unfinished and remains in the park today. This is actually the chair where he was when he was getting his portrait made. In FDR's will, he gave the house to the Georgia Warm Springs Foundation. In 1948, it opened as a museum. In 1980, the site became a part of the state park system and was named Roosevelt's Little White House State Historic Site. Interestingly, there's no state, as you can notice, up in the park's title. I haven't quite figured out why that is. It's one of the few ones in the park system to not use the word state in it. I'm still looking and solving that mystery. I don't really have any photos of it here, unfortunately. So there's the Little White House itself, where FDR lived when he was on vacation, and there's a museum, very nicely done museum, I should add. There's also at the Springs itself, the Spring House. I have a bunch of postcards up here of it. I can show you them afterwards. And the spring of the pools and all have been empty for many, many years, decades at this point. They announced recently they're actually undergoing restoration right now and will soon hold water again, allowing visitors to see exactly what it had been like when Roosevelt was there. A very, very big deal for the park. Oh, I do have photos. Oh, silly me. I really should have looked over his presentation a little bit more recently. That is completely my bad. This is what the pools look like when they are empty. I will say there's one part of it where it's still bubbling out of the ground, and you can actually put your hand in it. I was very surprised. The water is actually warm as it comes out of the ground. The name is no joke, and it's really buoyant, kind of like salt water. You really have like a bit of trouble putting your hand in. It is the strangest thing, but I look forward to seeing that fully restored. And this is just another view of the house from a little bit further away. I took a lot of photos when I was there. I've been there twice. Took many photos on both occasions, and I really like sharing them. Now, being here in Bartow County, I of course wanted to cover some of the Bartow County parks. First up is Red Top Mountain State Park, right here, just a couple miles away. For quicker works. The park is named for Red Top Mountain. No surprise there. Kenneth Krakow, in his 1975 book on Georgia place names, says the mountain is named after Red Town that was nearby, a local Native American settlement, and possibly a town of warriors. However, the Department of Natural Resources says the mountain got its name from the red, iron-rich soil found on the mountain. This name makes much more sense historically, as it's been used for iron mining in the past, hence the Iron Hills Trail out there at the park. The mountain sat next to the Etowah River, but in 1949, Allatoona Dam was put in on the Etowah, and most of the mountain was submerged by when the dam was created, especially by Lake Allatoona. In 1950, the remainder of the mountain was leased to the state and became Red Top Mountain State Park. And after World War II, there were many, many dams built inside the state of Georgia, and a lot of them ended up being state parks or wildlife management areas right on their shore, depending on how involved the state or national government were. There are many, many parks in the full video series that I did that have a very similar story in that regard. Now, to get to the park, there's of course Bethany Bridge, built back in the 1950s. I found this out quite recently, actually, to give an idea of the depth of the lake right there. The bridge is about 100 feet down below the original Allatoona Creek. I would not have guessed that driving across, but it is very deep at that point.
Can you say that again, please?
From what I saw online, is that if you go from the bridge deck down to the base of the original creek, it's about 100 feet right there. Which truly shows, I mean, as much as Red Top Mountain does not seem like a mountain today, without the lake there, it really would be quite imposing. The Pike has always been popular due to its variety of recreational options like boating and putt-putt, another mini-golf reference that I mentioned earlier. One option not seen as often today is sailboating, so when I found this postcard, I thought it was very interesting. And now seems a lot more of speedboat and motorboats personally. In 1989, the 32-room lodge was constructed, but it closed in 2008. It was demolished just a couple years ago, and a new visitor center opened in 2019 at the site, shown here. Oh, and I should add as well, I had a very, very difficult time finding a photo of a lodge. If anyone has a better one, feel free to email me. Near the visitor center is the Vaughan Cabin, which was moved to the site in 1993. The cabin actually dates back to the 1870s, and nearby, of course, is also the blacksmith shop, home of the iron pour programs. Lastly, the Pike manages Albertina Pass, just a couple miles away. The historic railroad cut once the site of a civil war battlefield in 1864. I could go into much more detail about this, but of course we have an entire exhibit upstairs devoted to it, so I got to encourage you to go up there. Today, Red Top Mountain is about 1,500 acres, offers hiking, boating, biking. There's a putt-putt course out there, a lot of picnic tables. We've picnicked many times at Red Top Mountain. Just a great Pike overall. This next one is also a North Georgia Pike. It's the Chief Van House in Murray County, very close to Chatsworth and Fort Mountain. The Pike preserves the home of James Van, the former Cherokee chief. Van was born sometime around 1763 and was the son of Wally Van, a Cherokee woman. It's unclear exactly who his father was, as there were many men named Van actually in the North Georgia area at that time. Chief Van would fight in the Cherokee-American Wars and made enemies with a rival warrior named Doublehead. After the war, he became the richest Cherokee and possibly the richest person in the entire South. Using his money, he built his house, called Diamond Hill or Spring Place, in 1804, the first brick house in the Cherokee Nation. Chief Van was also very important for bringing Moravian missionaries to the Cherokee. In 1809, he was shot and killed in a tavern. It's still not known who killed him, but there are many theories behind why it might have happened. After his death, the house was passed to his son, named Rich Joe Van. The house was so nice, the president, James Monroe, actually spent the night there once. In 1832, Joseph Van would hire a white man named Mr. Howell to run the house. Unfortunately, he did not know that under state law, a Cherokee man hiring a white man had just become illegal, so he ended up getting sued for this and ended up losing the house in the court case. He actually been sued for damages and won the house back. However, just after he won the house back, he was forced out of a Trail of Tears, losing it again. When he made it to Oklahoma, he actually rebuilt a replica of the home, but it was sadly lost during the Civil War. By the 1950s, the house had fallen to disrepair due to neglect. In 1952, local citizens bought it for just $5,000 and gave it to the state of Georgia. It then became the Chief Van House State Historic Site. It was restored and opened to the public in 1958. The park today is just about 137 acres and shares the story of a historic house, the Moravian missionaries nearby, along with what life was like for the Cherokees just prior to the Trail of Tears. Though I don't go into it in detail in this presentation, I also want to point out New Echota State Historic Site up near Calhoun, another fantastic pike talking about Cherokee life in North Georgia. Now the second Bartow County pike is Etowah Indian Mounds, very close by to us. The Etowah Indian Mounds are a series of Native American mounds from the Mississippian period. They were built on the banks of the Etowah River around 1000 to 1500 AD and are the best preserved Mississippian mounds in the entire southeast. There are 3 mounds in total, A, B, and C. Only, I believe it's A and C which is shown here. And here's Mound A. Mound A is called the Temple Mound and stands 63 feet tall. The town had 140 buildings and was protected by a wall and moat. You can tell this photo was taken a couple years ago, as I'm still taller than my brother. Has not been the case in several years now. When the site was first studied, it was thought to have been built by the Cherokee, or possibly ancestors of the Cherokee. It's now thought as built by the Etowah Mound builders, who are much more closely connected to the Muskogee or the Creek tribe. Today, the Muskogee consider the Etowah Mounds the most important ancient town. The Creek and Muskogee recognize 4 important settlements in the southeast as sort of their most important major early cities, and this one of the 4 is the most important one of them all. It is possible that one of the first European visitors was Hernando de Soto in 1540, as he did visit the area during his treks to the southeast. The first confirmed visitor, however, was a missionary named Elias Cornelius in 1817. Cornelius thought the mounds were about 200 years old, which was a fairly accurate assessment given the info available at the time. In 1838, Colonel Lewis Tumlin purchased the site, and his family would own the land for the next 115 years. Tumlin's descendants recognized they were an archaeological site and did allow work to be done on them to try to ascertain a bit of their history. In 1883, the Smithsonian came out and did a small study, but the first major study came in 1925 with Walter Moorhead, an early archaeologist. And he was who uncovered it was not a Cherokee mound site, but was actually more connected to the creeks. In 1953, Henry Tumlin, a descendant of Colonel Lewis Tumlin, sold the land to the state of Georgia. The park was established the same year and was given the name Etowah Indian Mound State Historic Site. The park today has a museum containing many artifacts found at the mounds, and the park is about 68 acres. In addition to the Dream Mounds and museum, there's a picnic area, hiking trails, there's some old fortifications. It's a very interesting place to visit. This next park is probably the most unusual home in the entire state park system. I love talking about it. It is the Wapham-Patterson House State Historic Site in Thomasville. Has anyone been here by chance? Okay, great. This will be a big surprise for a lot of people. Charles Wapham was born July 21st, 1852 in Vermont. After his birth, his family moved to Kalamazoo, Michigan, and in 1870, at the age of 19, his family moved to Chicago, where his father owned a shoe store. Just a year later, October 8, 1871, was the Great Chicago Fire. Wapham was actually caught in the blaze, but managed to survive. Afterwards, however, he developed pyrophobia, or a fear of fire. In 1873, Wapham established his own shoe store, which soon became quite prominent in the Chicago area. He and his wife, Emma, traveled to Thomasville, Georgia on vacation in 1882 and fell in love with the area. Thomasville was a very popular resort town at the time, and they absolutely loved what they found here. He bought land for a house, and construction began in 1884. It was a local architect named Tudu Romudol who designed the home, who, on a weird side note, was killed in a water tower collapse just a couple years later. It fell on him, I believe. The Wapham's new house had many modern features, such as indoor gas lines and hot and cold running water. Very fancy. Wapham, however, had some rather peculiar requests. He wanted as many exits as possible, so that in case of fire, he could easily leave. He still was suffering from that pyrophobia. Because of this, the house has 19 rooms and 24 exterior doors. Now, this is a very difficult house to design. That many doors, that many rooms. So the house is actually built in a horseshoe shape, with a courtyard, which, as you can see here, is basically just filled with doors. Now, continuing the fire theme, the top of the house, which you can see up there, is supposedly, and this one I do not put much credit in, maybe designed to look like a fireman's helmet. I think it's a bit of a stretch personally, but I think it's a fun idea. Now, on the third floor of the house, there was a stained glass window which looks over the yard. When light shines through in the spring and fall equinoxes, supposedly it makes the shape of a cow's head. Now, the Great Chicago Fire of 1871 was allegedly started when Mrs. O'Leary's cow knocked over a lantern, which may be where this came from. Again, this one also is a little bit of a stretch, but it's very funny. Now, after the home was completed, Lapham first enjoyed much success. In 1894, however, his shoe business failed, and he left Thomasville and sold the home. In 1904, the Patterson family bought it and gave it its current name, the Lapham-Patterson House. In 1906, Lapham's wife actually filed for divorce. She would die just 6 years later in a fire caused by a kerosene lamp. In 1919, Charles Lapham died and was cremated. Now, I've seen this picture online before where it looks like it's being haunted by people. This is like on the Pike website. It's evidently inside the house. I do not know what is up with it. I am very curious. I have not been here yet. I have to admit, it's on the other side of the state. If I do go visit, the very first thing I will ask when I walk inside the door is what is up with this picture. In 1971, the very unusual house was given to the state of Georgia for use as a museum. The house's restoration began in 1972 and took about 3 years to complete. Today, the house is still owned by the state of Georgia, but is actually managed by the Thomasville History Center. It is a one-of-a-kind house with a one-of-a-kind story. Now, this next park is Providence Canyon, near the city of Lumpkin in Stewart County. This unique pike has been called Georgia's unnatural natural wonder. After the signing of the Treaty of Indian Springs that I mentioned at the start of the presentation, many settlers came to the Stewart County area hoping to farm. By today's standards, they used very poor farming practices because they did not know about things like crop rotation, which had a horrible impact on the soil of the area. This led to an erosion problem in the sandy soil of Stewart County. Because of this, by 1836, a very small canyon had begun to form. It became known as the Providence Canyon after a nearby church, also called Georgia's Little Grand Canyon early on. Today, even though the farming has stopped, the rain and wind continue to erode at the weak soil here. Its deepest point is 150 feet below the canyon's rim. It is actually considered to be 16 different canyons with 43 different colors along the canyon walls. By the 1960s, there was a small church that had been established right sort of on the rim of the canyon, and families would often just have a Sunday picnic inside the canyon. In 1971, the state recognized this canyon's significance and purchased 1,108.6 acres from area landowners. The pike soon became one of the most photographed spots in the entire state of Georgia. The photos I've shown so far haven't quite done it justice, but I think this does a much better job showing it. In 1997, the canyon was declared one of the 7 natural wonders of Georgia. Despite the fact, must I emphasize this, it is not an actual natural wonder. It is created because of poor farming practices and erosion. Despite that, it still makes sense for a list like that. One of the pike's more unique features is an abandoned homestead along the canyon's rim. When the pike was purchased back in the 1970s, there was a house that was there along with some old cars, and they decided it would just be much easier and cheaper to leave it there instead of moving it out, and those resting cars can still be found there today. There's a hiking trail that goes out to them. Providence Canyon is today about 1,000 acres with 10 miles of trails, picnic tables, and an unnatural natural wonder of Georgia. It is absolutely beautiful. And because it is constantly eroding, it is my understanding that whenever you visit, you will never really be seeing the same view twice. It just is constantly changing. I find it unbelievably fascinating. This penultimate pike is Williamsville State Historic Site, very close to Savannah. Most of the pikes I talked about today have been, much more north of the state. I did talk about Lapham-Patterson House, but here we'll be getting off to the coast briefly. When James Oglethorpe came to the New World in 1732 to establish his brand new colony of Georgia, he brought many settlers with him. One of these men was named Noble Jones, who came to Georgia with his wife and 2 kids. In 1736, he applied for a 500-acre lease on the Isle of Hope, right near Savannah. The lease was approved in 1745, and Jones set to work quickly on building a fortified house. Now, this part of Georgia history is a bit of turmoil at the time. We were sort of a buffer colony between South Carolina and Spanish Florida. They expected attack at any moment, and that attack came in the 1740s with the War of Jenkins' Ear. Because of this, Noble Jones knew that he had to sort of defend his house, so he built both a house and a fort. He built it out of tabby, sort of a type of concrete made out of oyster shells. The house only saw action one time during the War of Jenkins' Ear, and after that was never saw battle again. You can see on the map here, use the fancy lazy pointer, you can see this is Captain Jones right here, and you can see the fortification there on the map. It's a little bit small. Jones would name his plantation Wormslow, W-O-R-M-S-L-O-W. A little bit different than how it's spelled today. He likely named it after the Wormslow 100, which is an area of Wales where the Jones family was from. Wormslow Plantation had many different crops, including rice, corn, fruits, and vegetables. Noble Jones also experimented with growing silkworms, but it was never really successful. There's a bit of a digression for Wormslow's story, but Georgia, in its early history, tried a couple of times to replicate China's agricultural products. They realized that Georgia is on the same latitude as China, and they thought China had a monopoly on silk, had a monopoly on tea, a monopoly on not indigo, what's the one I'm thinking of? Not rice. Well, yeah, I kind of had rice. But silk was really the main one, and they thought we can break the Chinese monopoly, we can grow it here inside a British colony. They quickly realized it doesn't quite work like that. While the latitude thing is true, there's very different climates. You can't really grow silk inside Georgia. So that abandoned all colonial hopes of that working out. Interestingly, it did not abandon all hopes in Georgia's history. The city of Canton, off in Cherokee County, was another attempt at that, which is why it is also named after what was then the primary manufacturing center for Chinese silk in Canton, China. Anyways, that has nothing to do with Wormslow. That's just a weird digression of weird Georgia history. After Noble Jones' death in 1775, the plantation passed to his daughter named Mary. Under the stipulation that after her death it be passed to her brother, Noble Wimberley Jones. It was a very specific reason Noble Wimberley Jones was sort of written out of his father's will like this. He fought for the Patriot side of American Revolution, and his father did not like this. However, after Mary's death in 1795, Noble Wimberley Jones was able to inherit the plantation. He would eventually give it to his son George in 1804, who served in the Georgia House, Georgia Senate, and was also mayor of Savannah. In 1828, George Jones built a new home at Wormslow. And the height of it is what's still there today. It was also George Jones who was responsible for making cotton the main plantation crop at Wormslow. In the early colonial period, cotton wasn't as big a thing. By the 1820s, becoming much stronger in Georgia, and the cotton plantations really became dominant. After George's death in 1857, it went through several other Joneses. First, George Frederick Tillman Jones, who changed the name to Wormslow with an E, and built the Grand Oak Line Drive at the entrance. And then eventually he eventually changed his name to George Wimberley Jones de Wren. And then he left it to a son of his, getting my notes all backwards. In George's will, he gave the house and grounds to an insurance company under the stipulation that after his death, it would pass to his grandchildren. There's a lot of weird will stuff going on in here. After George's death, Wimberley Jones would continue improving the house, and after Wimberley, the son's death, the insurance company gave it to the grandson. Eventually, after the 1929 stock market crash, it was inherited by Elfrida de Wren Barrow, who was a poet, one of the first women of Georgia Historical Society. And she was really helping to do a lot to preserve the home and bring it sort of back up to what it would have been like in the antebellum period. In 1973, the house was given to the state of Georgia and opened in 1979 as Wormslow Historic Site. Despite the park being owned by the state of Georgia, it's actually still controlled by descendants of Noble Jones. They still have a say in what happens at it. Today it's about 1,232 acres and preserves an important part of Georgia's early colonial history. It's one of several plantations preserved in that part of the state. So the last park I'll be covering today is not a current state park, but is a Bartow County one that you might have heard of. This is George Washington Carver State Park, up here in Bartow County, one of the few parks of African Americans inside the state of Georgia, back in the era of segregation. John Lloyd Atkinson was born on July 26, 1904 in Crawfordsville, Georgia, and he became very successful. In 1941, built a house in Atlanta. Unfortunately, the police said he could not move into the house, as it was built on a white-only city block. At that time, there were alternating street blocks in some parts of Atlanta, white-only, then black-only. Because of this, he couldn't move into the home, but he was encouraged to join the military, and he became one of the Tuskegee Airmen. During the war in June 1942, the Supreme Court actually ruled in favor of him, in his favor, so he could move back into the house, and ending the race block system inside the city of Atlanta. On coming back from the war, Atkinson and many other African Americans were upset that Georgia state parks were not open to them. At the time, they were all whites only. Inspired by this, in 1950, he petitioned the state of Georgia to waste 345 acres next to a brand new Red Top Mountain State Park. His efforts were very successful, and the new park was named after George Washington Carver, the famed scientist from Tuskegee. It is actually the only state park in Georgia history named after an African American. Atkinson was also made the park superintendent, built a clubhouse, docks, and a playground, and developed the park beach. It became an incredibly popular sort of tourist spot, especially for Atlanta families. Notable visitors included Andrew Young and the King family. Many performers also came to the park, like Ray Charles and Little Richard. In 1958, Atkinson fell ill and had to resign as park superintendent. He was going to find a jewelry and plaster business in Atlanta, and eventually would work as a plasterer inside a governor's mansion. The park's next superintendent was James Clarence Bentham, whose family grew up in the park on the park grounds, and his son, Robert Bentham, became the first African American on the Georgia Supreme Court. The park was very successful, attracting everyone from Boy Scouts to professional water ski club. However, after state park's integration, fewer people began coming to the park, favoring Red Top Mountain instead. This is a common story of the segregated state parks. There were 6 inside Georgia. After integration, all of them went away. There's only one of it's kind of still around today as this part of the state park system. There's a couple more photos of it, including one from Bartow History Museum. In 1975, it was turned over to the county, became Bartow Park, open only for reservations. In 2016, it was renamed George Washington Carver Park, and is once again open to visitors. And I will say, when I was researching this, I got a lot of info from the Bartow History Museum here. It was a very big help in researching this park's history. So with that, I've reached the end of the state parks in this presentation. I've covered just a brief snippet of the fascinating stories of what can be found here in Georgia. I do have for afterwards, up here on the table, all sorts of books, brochures, postcards, pamphlets, anything from the state park history.
Did you talk about your George backroads?
No, I did not. Shameless self-promotion here, and promotion for the gift shop. So in the other, you will see Georgia Backroads magazine, looking like this. And if you turn to page 14, you'll find my most recent article that I wrote on a former state park in Georgia. It is a very odd story. Back in the 1930s, they found a site of a Spanish mission right along the coast.
Don't give the story away.
That's true, you better buy the magazine. Yeah. Yes. Are there any questions? Any pikes I left out that you'd like to hear about?
I thought it was very interesting. Yes.
Andrew, tell us which one's your favorite?
A favorite of the ones I've visited, I'd have to say Providence Canyon, just because that's such a unique story behind it. Of the ones I want to visit, it would have to be the Lapham-Patterson House, though. I mean, that seems like a fascinating home to visit.
Blacktop Mountain.
Blacktop Mountain. There's not really much history behind it, unfortunately. It was founded back in the 1950s, I believe. There was a major Easter sunrise service across on top, which caused some legal issues back in the day. I don't remember much more beyond that, unfortunately.
That's the highest camping site in the state of Georgia.
I'll have to remember that. I'll have to make a note of that.
with Fort Mountain being the second highest.
And where's Black Mountain?
It's right near the state line, isn't it?
Andrew, what's your next project going to be?
Next project? Well, I'm studying classes at Kennesaw State in August, so probably that.
With this particular project, I don't think you were quite clear. You were researching the current state parks, and when you were researching this, you kept finding things.
Oh, yes. Yes, so I'll explain that. So, like, this is One of the brochures I brought along, one of the earliest ones we got. It's from the 1930s, we think. And inside it has many parks you may recognize, like Okefenokee Swamp or Fort Mountain. Here's Vogel, Pine Mountain, etc. There are also a couple other odd ones, like Santo Domingo State Park is in here. And there's one other one that, try as I could on the current state parks website, I could not find anything about them. And the reason is that they do not exist anymore. So I began, just as I went along researching these state parks, if I ran across a name, I would add it to a list. And eventually that list got 40 names on it. We have a lot of former state parks in Georgia. So after I researched all the current state parks, I went back and researched all the former ones, which have many other just crazy, weird, sometimes wacky stories behind them. That many of them did not sound real to some extent, but fascinating sites, and equally important in state parks history.
So why are they no longer state parks? What happened to them?
Anything and everything. That's where the wacky sometimes comes in. Sometimes it's budget cuts, which is a very normal thing. Not much excitement behind that. There are other cases where they preserved the wrong thing. One of the best examples of this is a house in Augusta. It was a Revolutionary War site where back in 1780, the British and Patriots were fighting off in Augusta, and some spies got hung inside the house from a banister of a staircase, and there's all these gory legends behind it from the Revolutionary era. So someone got the idea in the 1940s or so, let's preserve the house. This sounds nice. We have a house right here, this great history, it's a Revolutionary War site. Let's do it. Built a whole park around it, made a diorama overhanging. There's pictures of school children looking at it, looking very confused. Very morbid pictures. And after about 30 years or so, they decided to look back at the house's history. They knew it was a Revolutionary War site, didn't know much else about its time between the Revolutionary War, and it was preserved. And at that point, we realized we got the wrong house. The actual house was the one next door that had been demolished back in the 1840s. So they put the tail between their legs on that one, and it became a city park.
What about the county? Was there a county that had an abundance of parks?
Yes, so down in Decatur County, Georgia, it's where Georgia, Alabama, and Florida meet, right near the city of Bainbridge. There was a governor from that area named Marvin Griffin. And Marvin Griffin was evidently the king of political patronage of that time. And he could get as many state parks as he wanted to inside of his home county, and he did. He even got one named after his brother, believe it or not. There were about 5 state parks at one time inside of that one county. Most of them were just boat launches, not really anything historically significant, or natural wonders of anything. So a lot of those do not exist anymore. The segregated state parks that I mentioned, there were six sites that African Americans could visit inside Georgia before integration. 5 of them are no longer part of the state park system, George Washington Carver being one of those. Some of them became city parks. There's one that became a staging area for a contractor. If you go on Google Maps, you can see pictures of giant bulldozers sitting in the old Pike Pool. The 6th park was Georgia Veterans State Park that had a white and a black section, and they just merged them together into one park. It's the only one that's still around today. So, long story short, anything and everything led to these parks no longer existing. Some became national parks. It really just depends.
And you do that as another presentation.
Yes. Yes, that's presentations plural. All of this is presentations plural.
Any other questions? Let's give them another one. Andrew, thank you so much for sharing that fascinating story with us. And I do encourage you to check out his website. A lot of great videos and presentations there. I think I like the one about how the states got all their shapes.
Oh, I don't believe I did. I did. Did I do that? It's been 4 years. I don't remember, honestly. It's been a long time.
We do carry. Rebecca will be happy to sell a copy of the George Backwards to you right out the front of this. We are open. We'll stay open for a little while longer. While you're here tonight, check out our exhibits on the